We're having open and honest conversations about mental health and well-being. We should talk about it with Maira Ansari on Wave Now.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us here on Wave Now. I'm Maira Ansari with Dr. Stephen Taylor with UofL Hospital for our latest segment of We Should Talk About It. And today we want to talk about something that has really changed our world. We're talking about COVID, the pandemic, and I know some people are just completely burnt out on talking about COVID, but we're talking about how there's kind of like we're inching towards normalcy, but it's hard to not proceed with some caution, right, Dr. Taylor?
Well, for sure. And as we kind of work our way through a disaster response, there's a kind of a typical psychological reaction that we all have to that. Mm-hmm. We experienced that with the pandemic. At the very beginning of the pandemic, you can remember how we all had this heroicism.
Oh, yeah.
We would always show our heroes, our healthcare heroes. Whenever anybody got out of the hospital, they would get highlighted on the news. Mm-hmm. That's a typical early response to a disaster. And then we kind of get into the long game. We realize that this is going to be going on for a long time, and that kind of energy deflates. It seems like it emotionally flattens out. And we experienced that as well, right? So as the pandemic edged on, we weren't showing the heroes so much. We weren't having those spotlights. It became more drudgery, as we just kind of found ourselves living through the pandemic. And then we kind of get to a phase of recovery in a disaster that begins to move things back up towards normal. But that movement is not a smooth motion. It's a jagged line. It's kind of like looking at a stock market report.
Okay.
From day to day, from moment to moment, things go up and things go down. So we have days where things seem a lot better. We're recovering. We think the pandemic's over. We're going back to the restaurants. We're going to movies. And then there's an outbreak and people are going to the hospital and the numbers are going back up and we don't know whether we should wear masks again or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is a fairly typical response to a disaster, and we're in that phase now.
And it's normal to have, and we're talking about PTSD with this because in a major life event, a crisis, a global crisis that we were in, it's normal to have some PTSD. You may have lost somebody, a loved one, because of COVID. Maybe you had long-term effects from having COVID.
Right.
So this is a sensitive topic for so many people.
Absolutely. So many folks, like you say, have lost somebody close to them's had COVID, really had a bad case of it, had long COVID syndrome now that we're beginning to see. And we're also in a phase of this pandemic where we have variants that are so infectious that almost everybody knows somebody who's got COVID at any given moment. It just seems like it's ubiquitous now.
Absolutely.
So those things are all very traumatic. And we know something about the way the brain works and how trauma works on the brain. That exposure to trauma, and the more one is exposed to it, the more likely the function of the brain changes. So if we take something like the pandemic, which has been going on now for over 2 years, that's a long exposure to something that feels traumatic. Whether we acknowledge it overtly or not, it's very traumatic to experience that, and it changes the way our brains work. So now, even if we're in this recovery phase where we're beginning to move out of the pandemic, we're still going to be experiencing that shift because our brains have changed. They don't work the same way now they did 2 years ago.
Absolutely. Our reaction to things, maybe someone coughing or sneezing, is
Exactly.
a little bit maybe nervous of, okay, what's going
exactly.
on?
You think about what that's like. You're at the grocery store in the line waiting to get your stuff, and then you have to clear your throat, and you think very differently about it now than you did 2 years ago.
Absolutely.
Even though it's like, well, there's no way I have COVID. I'm kind of all to myself all the time, but we always think, oh my gosh, do I have COVID? And so that's become such a part of how we think and how we experience life now. It has changed us, and we have experienced that as change. And in PTSD and in trauma, we do know that the body experiences a lot of change in trauma too. We feel stress in our bodies. Anxiety could be in our backs or in our shoulders or in our stomach, or we can feel it in a lot of ways. People can get headaches when they have more anxiety and stress. So there are a lot of ways we experience that. And we're experiencing a lot more of that now because the trauma has had that effect on us, physiologically, not just emotionally.
Yeah, if you have a question for Dr. Taylor, would love to get it answered here on We Should Talk About It. Put it here in our Facebook comments, and we will get them answered for you. And I think for a lot of folks, if they've had COVID before, they're probably, and it was a bad situation, they're very frightened to get it again.
Yes, that is true. And when we read the news and we see reports that suggest that maybe in our lifetime, all of us may get COVID 2 or 3 times, over our lifespan, that can really be deflating. Like if let's say I had COVID and it wasn't a pleasant experience and I'm being told, well, you may get this 2 or 3 more times now. It's like, what? That's pretty terrifying. Because
we know, like, life kind of stops in some respects. You can't go to work, you're isolating, and you're worried about giving it to other folks. And, I had, if you have allergies or something, you're wondering, oh my gosh, is it COVID? You're taking tests and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, home test all the time. Yeah. So like your medicine cabinet becomes like a repository for home COVID tests, right? So, I mean, it's very traumatic, and there's a lot that we deal with emotionally in that. And when a pandemic kind of nears this recovery phase that we find ourselves in, which has its ups and downs, peaks and valleys, we have good days, we have bad days. There are days when it feels like the pandemic is just a fading memory, and then there are going to be days and weeks when it feels like it's all coming back and it's never going to go away. And that's kind of where we are in this recovery phase, and it's emotionally very difficult. And I think we need to keep in mind that it does have an emotional impact. We are going to feel that. And even more, the pandemic itself having been such a traumatic experience, years from now, we're still going to be dealing with the aftermath of our emotional response to that.
Sure, we're going to talk about it. You remember back in 2020, 2021, when we were dealing with the pandemic and COVID? Those are words were not in our vocabulary before, right? How often did we say the word pandemic? And, like now that's a part of our lives, and especially for children, that will be something that they lived through it, hopefully, and they'll talk about, the days where they were required to wear masks and learning from home. All of that happened so quickly in our world. Right. And it was really, truly turned upside down.
It was. And it's going to be different, too. And I think, one of the things that we deal with is this expectation that things will go back to the way they were. Life will be normal again. And the new normal is going to be a very different experience from what we experienced 2 years ago. So it's not going to be the same thing moving forward. So one of the things we see in trauma and as a post-traumatic stress response to trauma is there's a change in the way our minds function, and the way we interact with the world is different. So people who've experienced a real life-threatening trauma, moving forward, they're going to experience life in a very different way. It won't be the same thing again.
Right.
They're not going to experience it the way they experienced it before. In Uvalde, Texas, everything is different. Their lives are going to be different from now on. There's not going to be the way life was before the shooting at the school. And the pandemic, the life in the world is not going to be the same moving forward as it was 2 years ago. So part of what we do in this recovery phase of a pandemic is mourning. We are mourning a lot of loss. We're mourning the loss of loved ones, of friends. We're mourning the loss of retail stores that are never coming back. We're mourning
jobs lost.
Jobs that are lost. I mean, we're mourning so much that was lost in the pandemic. And part of what is involved in recovery is grief and dealing with our grief and our mourning. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to in this part of our work in the pandemic.
How do we approach other folks if they've lost someone, they've lost a spouse, they've lost a sibling, a son or a daughter, a mother or father, because of COVID, and being sensitive to that moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you say is important, and being sensitive to it is important. And understanding, to be listening, to be an ear, that people can talk to you and you can talk to them. I love some of the religious traditions that have this kind of culture of grieving where people will gather at the home of the bereaved, and they're not there to talk, or they're just there to be there, just to be with them. And if the person grieving wants to talk, they're there to listen. If the person grieving doesn't want to say anything but just wants to be there, they're there. And I think that tradition is so powerful and so important. We see so much in that that I think we can borrow from in how we approach and deal with people who have lost or are dealing with their own grief in all of this.
So since this is something that we are more than likely, kind of like the flu, we've lived with the flu for so many years, we're more than likely going to be living with COVID for a very long time,
right.
Maybe forever. I'm not a scientist, I don't know, so please don't quote me. But, how do we proceed with life? Because that's the one thing that we have learned from this is that, we have to push forward, right?
Right, that's true. We do have a lot of stuff in our armamentarium that we did not have 2 years ago.
Absolutely.
We have vaccines that are effective, that they help. We have booster shots that are effective and they help. As the COVID virus itself mutates, it tends to mutate, and it has been mutating to something that's less fatal than the earlier forms of it. And we hope that trend continues.
Absolutely.
We hope it continues to do that.
Yes.
And so those are a lot of things that we can hold on to, I think, as positives. How do we have hope in all of this? And I think those are some ways to do that. So even if we do face the pandemic, the COVID, the virus as we move forward, we have done things, and we do have things that have helped us in the here and now, and I think are going to continue to help us as we move forward.
Absolutely. Think about how we healthcare changed as well. Virtual visits became, it was something that was there, but now it's like a true aspect of going to the doctor. You ask if that's an option.
Right.
We do know how to do virtual homeschooling, as hard as it was. But, some of us found ways to work from home. I think we learned about how flexible that we have to be and can be. But I think as tragic, and this is also what I try to keep in mind, as tragic as COVID has been, never to undermine that, but I think we learned something from it as well. What's important?
Yeah.
Right. What can we prioritize in life? The things we can enjoy that's simple. I remember thinking, okay, we can just go to the park and be together as a family.
Yeah.
And that's a bonus that we're together.
Wait a minute, we can go outside?
We can go outside, but enjoy Mother Nature and enjoy we don't have to go spend a whole lot of money to find joy in life. Right?
I think that's right. Yeah. I'm old enough where being a kid was being outdoors all the time.
I'm with you on that.
Right?
You rode your bike outside until your mom was yelling at you to come in.
Exactly. The idea of being indoors was like, what? That doesn't even compute with childhood.
I know.
So it is kind of good to get back to that a little bit. There are things that we've gotten. Sometimes I think, what has COVID done for me? Right? Just kind of as a sort of a mental exercise. It's kind of half joking and half real. And, some of the things that COVID has done for me is helped me understand the value of virtual work and how virtual interaction can be fruitful and it can be useful.
Absolutely.
And it is one of those tools that can also be healthy and helpful in the mental health field as well. One of the things that we think about and that you and I have thought about together too is how do people people get access to mental health care, and what are the ways they reach out and get to it? And, virtual options are there, and they work, and they're helpful. And I think that's another tool that we've really seen grow during the pandemic that gives people more outreach that they didn't have before.
Absolutely. It's time saving. You don't have to worry about finding parking. You're not spending money on gas. I mean, there's been so many things that I think we have grown from because of this. For sure.
I agree with that. I think that is so true. And while there are a lot of psychological things involved in it that we could talk about sometime, about how one kind of transitions in and out of the work, it is very valuable, and having it, I think, has been very helpful, to be sure.
So if someone is dealing with PTSD or anxiety or depression over what has happened over the last 2 years, if you've lost a loved one, as we mentioned, lost your job, lost your home, how do you seeking therapy? How do you move forward knowing that this is going to be here?
Right. I think the first thing is to sort of realize that what we're feeling is normal. Mm-hmm. Everything you're feeling is a normal feeling. Feeling overwhelmed, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, feeling sad, grieving the loss of things that you used to have. Those are all normal feelings, and that's part of what's important for us to sort of grab hold of now, to understand that what we're feeling is normal. That's the starting place. And the second place is to reach out, not to be isolated. As we just sort of briefly mentioned, virtual therapy is an option. There are so many ways to connect, and there are so many avenues that are available online these days. All you have to do is just sort of type in the words virtual therapy, and just scores of things will show up. Resources in the community, primary care doctors, friends, family, and not letting yourself be isolated. That's so much, I think, at the front.
And I can personally say I've done virtual therapy. It is just kind of like you're FaceTiming your friend. It really does not feel, you may feel like, is this safe? Is this not safe? Or do you feel like it's as personal or intimate as being a one-on-one with somebody? I can say personally, I did not feel any different from sitting in a doctor's office, sitting in an office versus talking to my therapist on the phone. So
I think that's wonderful, and those are tools that can be very helpful. I think that's a kind of a new reality in a way. Telemedicine was a thing before the pandemic, but telemedicine kind of became the thing during the pandemic. And when I think about what has the pandemic done for us, I think advancing telemedicine has been one of the things that has been very fruitful and very helpful, and it shows our resilience too. Our capacity to be able to continue to work in spite of the hurdles that are in front of us.
And how do we deal with, say, folks that have the long-term effects of COVID? Whether they're constantly feeling exhausted, whether they are short of breath, whether they feel like, I'm just not the same person I was after COVID.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, part of it is us as a culture embracing it and holding on to it as real, and not downplaying it or ostracizing people or telling them this is just all in your head. There's nothing wrong with you, because that just makes it worse, right? Somebody already feels miserable, and then you've got somebody telling you, well, this is just all in your head. That just makes the whole matter worse. So I think holding it as a real thing is, we all have to do that. And
also realizing that your experience with COVID may not be the same as someone else's experience with COVID. So some people are like, it just was like a cold. Well, somebody else, it could be very, very different. I
think we've learned, too, that there isn't just one COVID.
No.
And I think that's also true of PTSD. There isn't just one kind of PTSD. PTSD is as varied as the people who suffer from it. And so, to deal with the trauma, to understand that COVID itself was a trauma, and that it's possible for us to be seeing PTSD as a consequence of it. To have our eyes open to it is so important as a first step.
And recognizing and respecting other people's boundaries. The other day I asked a woman, can I hug you? And she was like, no, COVID. And that's totally fine. I wasn't offended. I was like, I get it. I understand. People may not be shaking hands anymore. Maybe fist bumps or elbows. It is, So just that there are boundaries that folks have set up, and if someone chooses to mask, that we respect that.
Right.
And do whatever other people, what you feel safe and what others feel safe.
I think that's right. There's no just one way to deal with all this. And I think that, again, there's a lot of psychology, I think, behind our response to what other people are doing to protect themselves that shows some of the power of unconscious defenses in the mind in dealing with something like a pandemic. I think there are so many things here that could become topics for much, much longer conversations, but I'll just sort of say, at the beginning of the pandemic...
We could go on and on and on and on. This could go on forever,
we can totally
right?
go on and on about this. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I think that there were a large number of folks in this country who couldn't imagine that something like a pandemic could happen in the United States. It just can't happen to us. It could happen in China. It could happen in other countries, but it just can't happen here. And I think that feeling for a lot of people never went away. So it shows some of the power of unconscious mental defenses, the power of denial. We've all heard about denial, right? And that's a very powerful defense. And I think denial is a driving force for a lot of people who've experienced the pandemic. It just can't happen here. It just can't be real here. So confrontation with reality against that defense causes a lot of anger and rage to flare up. So a lot of what we've been seeing, a lot of the aggression, a lot of the yelling and fighting and the attacks we've seen over the pandemic and the precautions and social distancing and so on have been, I think, in a large extent, a byproduct of that kind of defensive response to the pandemic itself.
What happens if we deny things forever?
Well, you might walk off the cliff, right? I mean, that literally could be what happens. So, for some of the people in the pandemic, denial could have cost them their lives. For some people, denial could cost somebody else their life. I mean, there could be real dire consequences to that. So that's a very powerful defense, but it's a very dangerous one to ignore.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much. Always so good to talk with you.
Well, it's great to talk to you too.
Well, I'm Maira Ansari with Dr. Stephen Taylor from UofL Hospital for We Should Talk About It. Hope you have a wonderful day.